My name's Angus Walker. My day job is as a solicitor in a firm in Westminster. I specialise in the planning of large infrastructure projects. That's why I've been invited here, I presume. NIPA is an organisation that stands for the National Infrastructure Planning Association. You're all welcome to join that if you're haven't spent all your money joining the ICE. Actually, I have one story about the ICE. I used to work for the Parliamentary Labour Party, and we were due to hold the first meeting of the new party group of MPs after the 1997 election. How times have changed. And when they saw the election at the ICE building, it was all booked, and when they saw the election results, they phoned up and said, "We're sorry, but we've seen how many MPs you're going to have, and we think the floor will collapse if you have the meeting in our building, so we rescind the offer of them." So we had to have it in a different building in Church House instead. I like the engineering reason why they couldn't have it in that building. As I say, how times have changed. Anyway, a complete tangent there. So I'm going to talk about four things to sort of set a bit of context, I hope. So you want an infrastructure project somewhere. There are four things. I'm not even talking about building it, but before you even build it, there are four things you need before you can even start building it. So this is a challenge of infrastructure priorities. Who decides what is the priority? What's more important than what else? So getting some sort of policy backing is your first challenge. Who is it who is going to take forward your project? Is it you it's unlikely to be you as a private individual or you as a company, maybe it might be. Thirdly, you need some sort of permission to build it. And fourthly, you need some money to build it. So let's go through each of those in turn. First one, who decides the priorities? Well, I suppose the obvious answer is the government. And indeed, they do produce, for very large infrastructure projects, a series of what are known as national policy statements. In fact, today is a very exciting day in my world because for the first time for 4 years, I think, a new national policy statement is being published on airports. In fact, on one airport, on one runway at one airport, and this is all it's going to cover, I believe. We'll hear a bit more about Heathrow a bit later, so I won't steal any thunder there. So that's one way. It sets out what is needed. It doesn't often refer to particular projects, but it can, and in this case it will. The only other one that really does that, well, there's two others. There's a nuclear power one that sets out 8 sites for nuclear power stations, and there's a wastewater one which promotes the Thames Tideway Tunnel, the super sewer in London. So it's unusual actually to get a particular project mentioned in one of those. Secondly, that's not the only statement of government policy and priorities. The government has obviously other policy declarations, each department. So if you're doing a transport project, you want the backing of the DfT. Energy project, you have to watch the moving target of which department you're using, but it's now BEIS, Business Energy Industrial Strategy, and so on. There's also this new thing, the National Infrastructure Commission. Has everyone heard of the National Infrastructure Commission? I have a bit of a bee in my bonnet that its public engagement is not very good. It's setting the landscape for infrastructure until 2050, and yet the people in this country haven't even heard of it, which is a bit worrying. I think they should spend a lot more on getting people involved in what their own future will look like. But that's just me. I hope it's not just me. There's a new game in town as well, apart from the National Infrastructure Commission. The word regional was banned in about 2010 when the coalition government took over, but they have realised there's a bit of a gap between national and local, and so we don't use the word regional anymore, we use subnational. So there are quite a lot of new groups of local authorities and new bodies sitting above them that are being created in the last couple of years. So there are things called combined authorities, which are just groups of local authorities, and then there are other things you may have heard of, like Transport for the North or Midlands Connect, which are particular bodies that are charged with providing infrastructure in large areas of the country. So you can persuade one of those to adopt your project. If you're a public utility company, electricity, water, so on, you are obliged under your founding act to publish a 5-year plan of what you're going to build to meet the needs of the people who need electricity, water, etc. So there you can see in advance what they're going to build. So it's not really government policy, it's really up to the utility company itself. So it's Thames Water that came up with the idea of the Thames Tideway Tunnel. I think there's going to be a lot of need for more water in London. That's wastewater, but the water side of it. So they're either going to have to build new reservoirs or pump water from wetter parts of the country further away. So there's going to be some big water infrastructure projects coming up. Finally, down at the local level, smaller projects are obviously the policy of local authorities. So depending on the size of your project, you should call that one of these and get it backed by policy. Secondly, who actually promotes the project? Well, the very largest projects, you heard mention of HS2 and Crossrail, are promoted by the government by an act. They each get their own Act of Parliament, and there's one for HS2 just about to get royal assent in a couple of weeks, and there was one for Crossrail, but those are really only the very largest projects. Next down is these new subnational transport bodies. So they're all producing plans at the moment. Transport for the North Midlands Connect. England's economic heartland is another one, a bit between Birmingham and London. They're sort of popping up all over the place. I don't know if the whole country eventually get covered by these, but certainly the large conurbations will. I put TFX because the number of new transport for something that have appeared in the last couple of years has been amazing. Transport for London is the first one. There's a transport for Wales, there's a transport for West Midlands, and there's transport for the North, and there's a transport for Greater Manchester. Scotland is just called Transport Scotland. They decided to be slightly different and not have a for. So they may promote some project, and we have yet to see. They're quite at a formative stage, but Transport for London certainly does promote projects. So it'll be backing Crossrail 2, the new northeast to southwest second line of Crossrail that's on the cards. And obviously they expand their own tube and train network. Local authorities sometimes promote infrastructure projects, but rarely, I would say. The M1 junction between Junction 10, just up the road, to 10A to Luton Airport, that was upgrade of that dual carriageway, was promoted by Luton Borough Council a few years ago, so it does happen. Finally, private companies. I divide these into regulated and unregulated because the utilities are the regulated ones, so they've had to provide a plan to say what they're going to build, and then they have to build them. Whereas unregulated companies can simply come up with an idea and decide to build it if they wish. So indeed I'm working on a project to reopen Manston Airport near Ramsgate in Kent, which is a very entertaining project. And that is just a private company that decided it wants to do that. Next, getting permission. So this is the bit that I know the most about because I do this all day. Essentially planning permission, but there are different kinds of that for different types of project. Smaller projects do just need planning permission from the local authority. Larger ones above a certain size, Heathrow Runway 3 will be an example of this. Thames Tideway Tunnel was an example. Hinkley Point C, Sizewell nuclear power stations, those sort of things. They need what's called development consent. It's a special regime that was created probably because of Heathrow Terminal 5 taking so long to get consented a few years ago. That took, from the application going in to the decision being granted, was about 7 years, when everyone really knew it was probably going to get granted in the first place. And there are other things you need depending what you're getting in the way of as well. So I won't go into great depth on that, but I can answer questions on that later if you like. One of the biggest sort of area that is outside your control as building a new project is you probably may not, unlikely to own all the land that it's going to be on. So you can sometimes get compulsory purchase powers. So Heathrow Airport will be applying for those to extend its footprint, to acquire the land it needs to build its third runway. Thames Water did the same. Most of the super sewer just going under the middle of the Thames, although that's still owned by somebody. It's owned by the Port of London Authority and the Crown and people like that. But there are lots of sites on the riverside where there's going to be infrastructure all the way along, and that belonged to somebody else. So they got compulsory powers. Sometimes if you don't have compulsory powers, local authorities have a general power to acquire land. So you can have some sort of deal with the local authority that they will use their powers to acquire the land and then give it to you, sell it to you. But if you don't have any of those, then I'm afraid you've got to negotiate with the landowner, who will obviously, if they realise that you desperately need their land, will charge you an arm and a leg. So it's probably better to have compulsory powers, because when you acquire the land at market value when it's compulsory purchase. Although I think Heathrow have offered to pay over the market value as one of their ways of making their project more acceptable to the local community. Finally, and the big one, getting money to pay for your project. I've tried to sort of think of it from first principles quite generally about how all the different ways you might get money for your project. So simply getting the government to pay for it is obviously the best way, but the least likely if you're just a small private company. But if you're someone like Highways England, who builds new motorways and large A roads, they simply get an allocation in the spending statement for money from the government, which has been raised by taxation from all of us. You may get funding from your local authority. There's a thing that also came in with the Act that created this regime for development consent called the Community Infrastructure Levy, which you probably heard of, or CIL. And each local authority is required to produce a plan on what it's going to spend that on. So those are some named infrastructure projects, but they're obviously much smaller. If you're a private company, you may simply have some investors who want to help you fund your project with the expectation of some sort of return on their investment afterwards. Through somehow running the project will earn money and they'll get their money back. In fact, infrastructure projects are regarded as a very reliable source of investment. I'm not quite sure how Heathrow is owned, but Gatwick certainly, about 40% is owned by one company, Global Infrastructure Partners, and the rest of it is split between three very large overseas pension funds who own it, who are expecting to get a return on their investment. Customers I put because this is again utilities probably. Thames Water is paying for its super sewer from an increase in water bills or wastewater, sewerage bills from all its customers. And I put customers, make the distinction between customers and users, because that'll include all their customers, not just the ones who will benefit from that super sewer. So their area extends as far as Reading and further north and south of London. So those people will be paying for the sewer even though they're not going to really benefit from it. Users obviously is the easiest one, particularly for transport, a railway project. You borrow against people paying fares to use your project. I expect Heathrow will be doing some combination of all these, but users will be one of them. And finally, I put beneficiaries as a slightly wider category than users. So, and this is where it gets quite interesting, because there are moves to sort of tap into who's going to benefit from a project, not necessarily use it. So for example, if you build a new station, the properties around the station will go up in value. And through no fault of the people living there, they'll just get a nice increase in their value. So should you be able to at least pay for some of that infrastructure through some sort of local land tax on the people whose properties will go up in value? Controversial, but at least if the landowner gets some of the benefit and the infrastructure provider gets some of the benefit, you share the benefit, then maybe that is an answer. So there's some food for thought and ways to fund your project. I think I've covered my 4 areas now. I believe I'll be sitting in the panel session a bit later, but if you have any immediate questions, please do ask now.
Thank you very much, Angus. Cheers.
you.